Do you want to live for God, but you're unsure of exactly what that looks like, what that even means? Do you want to synthesize the way that you have read commands in the Bible with everything that you know about what wise living is, but you struggle with kind of how to put everything together, how to combine all of these beliefs? Well, this episode is for you. In this episode, we are going to be talking about creating a method of Christian living. So we're creating a method based on our faith that impacts every part of our lives. This is going to deep dive into practical theology, and it's going to kick off our series on why what you believe matters. So I hope you'll join us. Welcome to A More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. We know that in the hectic hurry of everyday life, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters. This is a moment to pause and realign your focus on the one who gives us peace and rest. We're focusing on discipleship, productivity, and homemaking as we live with eternity in mind. This is the place where you'll learn to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher. Thanks so much for joining me. Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 29 of season 1 of the podcast. This episode today is going to kick off our series on why what you believe matters. And what we're going to be focusing on today is looking specifically at the basics of the series, what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be setting the foundation of what we're doing. And today specifically, we're going to talk about creating this method for Christian living, this method of practical theology. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be thinking about 3 different steps. And then the next couple episodes are going to go in depth on each specific step. So the 3 steps for creating this method of Christian living are creating a statement of faith, determining core virtues, which are like values that we can base our life on. And then we're going to have these guiding principles that we create. And that's the last step that we create that act as these guardrails, these guideposts for our everyday living. So what we're going to be doing today is setting the groundwork for those 3 steps. And then in future episodes, we're going to break down what those look like. And so today, what we really always have to ask ourselves is, why do we need to do this? And so we're going to get into that in just a minute. But before we do that, I just want to let you know that if you go to the shop, you're going to see lots of new resources. I've created lots of budgeting resources that you can look at with that. So cash envelopes, things like that. If you are interested in those, you can also look at the shop for any of the resources that you're going to hear about today and in future episodes. So I'm currently working on a workbook that talks about creating your personal statement of faith, developing your core Christian virtues, and then also one that develops these guiding principles for your lives. So you can go to amorebeautifulifecollective.com/AMBL shop and look at all of the resources on that. Also, don't forget to leave a 1 to 2 sentence rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the best way to support the show, and it's completely free. But by doing this, it really helps others find the show. And obviously, you can also subscribe, and you can also share this podcast itself, and then also the show with anybody that you might think would like it, because it's a great way to grow the show, and I would just be so appreciative of that. Now, on to the episode. So in this podcast series, we're going to be talking about our beliefs, and specifically why what we believe matters, how right doctrine and right beliefs and right understanding of the Bible, how that leads to right living. Now, keeping this in mind, if you've grown up in the church or in the faith, you might know that, Christian faith is based on belief, and most of us would have that response to belief. We know the right answers, right, to some of our doctrines, whether that is saying, I believe in God, that He's the creator of the world. I believe that Jesus died on our sin. We know these doctrines, but we also deal with the noise in culture that says that, what is truth? Does truth really matter? Does what you believe really matter? Because I listened to a couple podcasts recently, and they've been saying that, there's kind of this universalist sense where, all paths lead to God. And they've actually said, that's kind of offensive if you talk to it. It's like if you say, Islam and Judaism and Christianity are all the same. Anybody who actually practices these beliefs know that they're not the same, not at all. But we kind of have this idea in culture that, all religion is the same, just like everything else in culture is the same, man and female, whatever. And because of that, they say that, what does it matter if you believe in Allah, or what does it matter if you believe in God? It's a religion. It's the same thing. And we know that that's not the case, that what we believe impacts every part of our lives. So a doctrinal belief impacts our lives, but we need to say how. How does it impact the way that we live every day? We need to know what's true and we need to hold to that thing. We don't need or want to be wishy-washy in our faith, but a lot of times we are because we've never taken the time to really stop and consider our beliefs and why we believe what we believe and how those beliefs impact the rest of our lives. The thing is, this is talked about in the Bible. In 1 Peter 3:14 through 16, it says, "But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear them or be intimidated, but in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy. Be ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do this with gentleness and reverence, keeping a clear conscience, so that when you are accused, those who disparage your good conduct in Christ will be put to shame." So my question to you is, do you know what your theology is? Do you know what your personal statement of faith is? Do you know how to apply these things? And some of you, I know some people who listen to the podcast, they would say, of course I do. I could debate you any day. And they already have this defense, which is great. But some of us might feel a little bit wishy-washy. Like we know some things, but some things we might need to refine, to hone our answers to be able to give that defense. And so we are going to be talking about why it's important to do that, why it's worthwhile to do that. There is a certain part of Christianity that says, none of those beliefs really matter. What matters is what you do. So if you are not focused on, serving other people, on doing some of these social justice initiatives, then what you say you believe doesn't really matter. But I would say the Bible says, no, that's not the case at all. We need to be able to do both. We need to demonstrate our faith through our works. And so that is what we're going to be focusing on, is looking at our faith and our practical application of that faith. How do you think about the deep things of God in the midst of meal planning and diaper changes and running to and from, being the chauffeur service for your kids, going back and forth from work? How do you do both? And this is what we are going to be talking about today. This episode is for you. So when we hear the word theology, most of us probably think of scholarly text and professorial lectures. We think of kind of the academia aspect of theology. Whenever we think of theology, most of the time it doesn't really seem to hold much real weight in the world. And we might even have that, kind of school age answer of like, how does this impact real life? My church is very focused on theology. And I remember feeling like that whenever I was in high school. I was always kind of like, what does it matter? Why can't we just focus on other things that seem to have more practical application? I don't want to talk about all this theology anymore. I want to talk about real life. And I think as we look at the Bible, we need to develop this kind of method in order to understand how everything that we believe impacts our life. Many times we ask ourselves these questions of, if I know I love God, that's all that matters, right? I just need to love God and love people. And that is something that's become even more popular today, to say that the only thing you have to worry about is to love God and love people, that, these are the two greatest commandments. And we do know that. Many evangelical circles, actually, I've heard people that say like the only thing that you should preach is you should just preach the gospel over and over again. And I think that's true. Like Jesus has done the saving and we need to preach that. But I think what we have to understand is if we look at the Bible, the message of the Bible is, yes, focused on, the redemptive nature of the cross, but it's also focused on everything else. And so if we look at the gospel is the foundation, it's the cornerstone of our beliefs. But theology itself, it impacts everything in our lives. So it can seem like, if we just focus on this idea that the only thing that matters is just to preach the gospel to yourself. And then I say, okay, well, how does that impact me in the midst of, messy diaper changes and kids crawling over the couch and trying to get to church? Like, how do I take this belief and how do I then translate that into how I should act every day? I think that requires a little bit more thought than just saying the gospel changes things. Yes, it does, but we have to think about how. How do we live once we are saved? Once we've accepted the gospel that Jesus has died for our sins and we believe in him and we call him Lord, how should we then live after we have decided to follow after him? And so I think this is where, this idea of practical theology, it is the application of our belief to our actions. And so through our practical theology, we make our faith alive and active, and we become the hands and feet of Jesus. And so this is where this idea of a method of Christian living comes into play. Now, as a prospective homeschooler, my kids are 3 and 1, so I'm not quite there yet. But one of the things I've done is I've done a deep dive, as you can imagine. I've done a deep dive into all the research of all these different methods. And if you are unfamiliar with homeschooling, there's lots of different types, right? So you have like unschooling, you have forest schooling, you have classical education, and then they have this type called Charlotte Mason education, which is what I've dived into. And I really admire a lot of her insight into education and what she promotes. And so one of the things that I've been looking at with her is the way that she describes the full method of her education. And that's what she calls it. And this is why it's specific. It can seem like I'm just using words willy-nilly, but really she is very specific with her terminology. She uses this word method, and this is why. A method is different than a process or a curriculum because, as you can imagine, a step-by-step scope and sequence where you say you learn A and then B and then C, and then you go through this. You can think of standards of education, especially like for math or for social studies, where you go through point A, B, and like kind of like an outline of what you are learning. That is like a scope and sequence, a process, a curriculum. Giving you a book list is an example of kind of that process or curriculum. But with the method, it's very different. Instead, a method is established on a set of principles, and these principles are kind of theoretical in nature. I have a copy of Charlotte Mason's 20 Principles of Education online, but for instance, one of her principles, and this is the first one, is that children are born persons. All right, well, what does this mean? If you haven't been in Charlotte Mason circles, you might be a little bit unfamiliar. You have to think about it, right? That is something that if I just told you this, you might be like, okay, what does that really mean? But the idea of children being born persons is that children are not blank slates. So there's this idea of tabula rasa, which is like you're a blank slate, and everything that I do, I can just pour all of my ideas on you, and I basically form you as a person. So me as a human being teacher, I can form another human being teacher and morph you however I want you to be. But we know that's not the case, right? If God has created somebody, God is the only one who is doing the forming. And so these born persons are born with personalities, with interests and different things like that. And because of that, everything that you do as a teacher, you're only kind of bringing out this thing that God is already doing. Charlotte Mason is a Christian educator, and because of that, she talks about the idea of, the education, the chief purpose of education is this formation of character. So everything that we do, the atmosphere that we create, the disciplines or habits that we give our kids, and the life of education that we do, everything that we do is trying to develop this God-given nature in them in order to develop this character to lead them on the good and right path. So you can see how it's a very simple statement, right? This principle, children are born persons, a very simple statement, but it impacts basically all of a child's education and the way that you approach it. You want to give them a wide feast of curriculum, which is another Charlotte Mason idea, because you want to present them with a lot of different ideas because you don't know what their God-given personality and talents and calling is. And so you want to present them with a feast and see kind of what strikes their interest and what they want to pursue later on. And so as you can see with this example, in a method, you have these principles that are kind of theoretical, right? That's abstract. Children are born persons. That's abstract. It requires your thought. It requires your focus. It requires you to really take this idea and kind of internalize it. But in doing that, it gives you such a rich foundation that you can then fall back on. So later on, if you know all of her 20 principles, then later on, as you're trying to pick and choose decisions of books that you want to read or other curriculums that you are thinking about choosing, you could say, okay, does this curriculum or does this thing that I want to do, does it match the method that I've chosen? And because of that, if it doesn't, you say, no, I don't want to do it. Or if it does, then you kind of use your method and you apply it to something else. So the reason why I'm going into this idea is because I think this is really what's got me thinking about developing a Christian living method, a method for Christian living, is thinking about how can we develop these kinds of principles in order to create a flexible understanding of what the Bible is teaching us and being able to apply that in our everyday lives. Really, I think that this is what every pastor is trying to do. This is what every teacher, Bible teacher is trying to do. They're trying to give you some guiding principles where you can take these ideas from the Bible that they've distilled for you, and then you can apply it to a wide array of things. The Bible is full of these principles. But I think all too often, if you take a piecemeal approach to Christian living, instead of you thinking about all of these things as like a holistic view, you kind of pick and choose principles that you like. Maybe you kind of gloss over ones that you don't like, or that's just like a hole in your education of the Bible. And because of that, you kind of have a skewed view of how you should live as a Christian. And you come up with things like, well, God is love and love is love, so I should just promote love. Well, that's not a guiding principle from the Bible. Like the Bible never preaches that. That's anti-Bible, right? That's not the God of the Bible. That's something that you've kind of pulled from something because you haven't heard the full story, maybe in your exposure to what you are reading or listening to. And so I think this is why it's so important that we work to develop this method. I think, again, to draw some distinctions, the principle informs the practice that we do. And so if you look at the difference between a method and a process, a method is, again, details that can be followed. You can follow it without knowing the why behind it. So imagine like an open and go teacher's guide or something like that, where you read sentences and then the child is supposed to do something else. That would be kind of like open and go. We do those responsive readings at church. I don't know if y'all do that, where anybody could walk in and do a responsive reading, right? But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily taking anything away from it. So if you can follow something without knowing the why behind it, it might be a process. It could be legalistic, step by step. It requires strict adherence. It assumes that you're moving linearly toward the end goal, and it kind of requires this conformity. And I think a lot of times in the Christian faith, we really teach it as a process, this kind of legalistic conformity where you have to act a certain way. And people rebel against that. And so they're like, I'm done with Christianity. And so then they're left with nothing. They're left with no kind of process of Christian living. And again, we get into these holes and these misunderstandings of the faith. And so I think a method, on the other hand, is something that's guided by principles, like I've talked about. It's flexible. And the principles kind of act as these like guidelines for how we should live. The actual living out is dependent on everyone's circumstances. So again, if you take that Charlotte Mason example, some kids are going to have an aptitude for math. Some are going to have an aptitude for music. Some are going to have an aptitude for handicrafts, so like woodworking. And so the actual living out of the method is going to look very different because some of your days are going to be filled with music. Some are going to be filled with going to shop class, and some are going to be filled with, whatever else. And so because of that, the actual living out of a method is going to look very different for each person. You have to apply the method with discernment. So I think, again, principles, they have this holistic view as you're moving toward the end goal. And obviously the end goal is, the kingdom, right? That is what we are working towards. But not everybody takes the same path. And that's why I think sometimes, even if you look at something like marriage, like people feel like, okay, well, to be saved, I need to be, and this is something that's a little bit probably more specific to women, but a lot of times now there's such this kind of glorification in Christian circles. This is not in society, but in Christian circles, there is now a new glorification of like homemaking and staying home and being a mom at kind of this domestic monastery. And this is a good thing. It's a good thing to try to redeem the home. But if you said, oh, well, the only way that you can be a good Christian is if you get married young and have lots of kids and homeschool your kids and, have a farm and all this kind of stuff. And that is the only way that you can proceed toward this end goal. That's a process of Christian living, but it's also false. And you can clearly see that it's false. Like, I think even people that are living this way, would tell you, oh, well, no, I don't need to do this to be saved. But I think there's this kind of this tension where people are acting like everybody else under the sun needs to follow this process of Christian living. But we know that that's not the case. Like, that is not what it means to be a good Christian, is to homeschool your kids, stay at home, homestead, all that kind of stuff. So Sally Clarkson, I've talked about her before, but one thing that she mentioned is that, each person has to figure out kind of their puzzle pieces of living. So you have all of these pieces of life, your ministry, your talents, your callings, your roles and responsibilities, and you have to figure out how to kind of put those things together in a way that glorifies God. And so a method allows you to do that because, again, you're creating these guardrails where you are basing on biblical principles what your life looks like, what you can and can't do. But then you're also it helps you cut through the noise of life and what's cultural and what's biblical, and helps you make decisions that glorify God in the best way possible. So we can see how a method can be beneficial, how it can be beneficial in the case of, home education with the Charlotte Mason method, but also it can be beneficial to us as creating, a method for Christian living. So looking at this, we have to say, okay, well, how would I actually do this? How would I create this method of Christian living? And I've been calling this kind of practical theology. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next episode about what practical theology actually is. But I think the reason why this is so needed is in the days of like the high church. So think about like the Catholic Church, maybe even like the Anglican Church. But in the days of the high church, you had this method of Christian living. You had a lot of requirements that you had to do. You had to go to mass like every day. They would have the reading of the word, the liturgy. They would have all of these different sacraments that you had to do. But again, with the Protestant Reformation, we tore all of those things down. And instead of giving you a way of living, they just said, well, especially now in evangelical times, it's basically just you need to believe in God and then love God, love people. That's it. But again, I think people, they so desperately want to be told what to do that they either heap other laws and rules on their life, or they use that to kind of be the Lord of their own life. I think you can see that there's some more like legalistic faiths that have said, well, we're going to create this own rule of living anyway, because of the corruption, that they saw in the world. So if you look at like the Puritan Pilgrims, they did this, the Amish and other more legalistic Christian faiths, they try to create this rule because they saw this need for some kind of method. But again, they dove, instead of saying, okay, we're going to make something that's a little bit more flexible, they created this kind of process of Christian living that was really legalistic and was, I think, a kind of a false gospel of what they were trying to say. It was kind of Pharisaical. At the same time, we're still hungry for that method of living. And in recent years, I've seen this push towards this more legalistic way of living. Again, talking about, the women being stay-at-home moms, homemakers. There's now a push I've seen too of kind of like modesty codes are coming back. And again, they're self-imposed. These are not like some man is telling them that they have to do this, but there's a whole group on Facebook that they say, okay, you can't wear pants anymore, or you have to have head coverings, which I'm not sure, I have not studied into head coverings. I don't feel convicted to wear a head covering, but maybe I will. I don't know. And you also have Christians who are Torah observant Christians. So there's these people that, again, they're pursuing this method of Christian living. And I think it's because it's this method that drifts into a process. So it's not a true method because it's very legalistic and kind of this, you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to reach this end goal. But I think it's because people want something that they feel like they can do in order to save themselves. And we know that this goes against what the Bible says, that we don't save ourselves through our own actions. So we want something to do. We want to see how our faith can impact our life. We're hungry for that. We want to have our faith automatically impact our life. We want to see the fruit of our faith in our lives. But we also don't want to drift into these legalistic codes. And I think this is what the method does, is it helps us to kind of walk that fine line in the middle where a method will not get so legalistic that we will be acting in judgment towards other people, or will be maybe hurting other people with the kind of, heavy yoke that we put on them. Whereas it gives us these guardrails and guideposts that we can walk along so that we are walking on the narrow path. So basically, a method of Christian living, it will help us to have that narrow path where we are choosing to live wisely and choosing to live for God. And part of this is just because a method requires us to think about these kind of theoretical things of what we believe, kind of wake up out of the, hypnotic stance this hypnotic state that we all live in modern life. And instead of living this way, we wake up and choose to live for God daily. The first question that we have to ask ourselves, now I've talked about why a method is so important, is we got to talk about what you actually believe. Okay, so far I've been telling you about this method, and you might be like, this is okay. Or maybe you might be thinking, I'm not really sure. But the first question you have to ask yourself before we get into anything else about how you actually create this method, the first question you have to ask yourself is, do you believe that God really cares how you live? Now, if we were in class, what I would be doing right now is I'd be taking like a little 10-second water break where I'm waiting and counting in my head. They have like that 10-second or 15-second rule where you don't talk until somebody responds. That's what I'd be doing, because you really need to think about this question. Does God really care how you actually live? Because I think a lot of people, they don't believe that. They believe kind of this like deistic way of living where they think, what I do doesn't really matter. God doesn't really care. He cares what I believe in. And at the end of, I'll deal with, heaven or hell or the kingdom or whatever. I'll deal with that later on. But they never really think about their everyday actions and how that is impacting God and their fellow man. Instead, they're just kind of going through the motions. And I think it's important that we ask ourselves this question, because if we believe that God actually cares how we live, then we need to have an answer for how should we live if we believe in God. God cares about what we do in the everyday. He cares about our practical theology. He cares about what we do after we get saved. And so what we have to figure out is, what commands should we follow? What are commands that we're getting from the world that God doesn't really care about? And what are things that we must do if we are going to call ourselves the people of God? As we think about this, we're going to kind of drift into thinking a little bit about our beliefs and restoring our beliefs. And I talked about this in the episode where we talked about our 3 winter seasons. One of the things that is very common in culture today is this idea of deconstructing our faith or deconstructing our beliefs. And this trend, I talked about it in that episode as well. It was said because culture is, misogynistic, racist, classist, all of those different things, all the ist. Because of that, we have to take away all of the old beliefs and reconstruct or deconstruct those beliefs in order to figure out what's really true. But one of the things I talked about in that episode is that really, whenever you're going through and trying to deconstruct all of these beliefs, there is no reconstruction. All they want to do is tear down everything, tear down truth, tear down anything that people say, and they want to just leave it torn down. So we're just having this like ruins of truth and ruins of culture, because nobody is trying, after they tear down all of these things that they say is bad, there's nobody going around and trying to pick and choose what beliefs are actually good and moral and should be pursued. I think of this as kind of like the person, we've all met these people where they go around and they want to criticize everything. So like, oh, this isn't good. I don't like this. I don't like whenever you make a meal like this, or I don't like whenever the church does something like this, or I don't like whenever the worship music is too loud. But they don't ever give a solution to it. And so instead what they're doing is they're just criticizing. Their whole life is just spent criticizing other people. But if you don't give a solution to something, all you're doing is just tearing down other people, and you're deconstructing the people around you. And so I think we have to be careful whenever we start talking about something like this, something like creating a method for Christian living, because what is crucial to this is you examining your beliefs But what I'm talking about with this is not examining your beliefs with a goal to tear them down. Instead, what I'm talking about with this is examining your beliefs with a goal to restore them in order to strengthen them. There is a couple different terms that can be helpful with this. One of the terms I've heard is kind of like the Reformation. The Reformation happened with the Protestant Reformation. So if you're a Protestant, you could say that you're like reforming your beliefs so that you're getting closer to, that original biblical Christianity. You could also say that you are being a restorationist. I've heard that term too, and I like that term, where you're trying to restore, your beliefs to biblical Christianity. Again, both of these kind of hit on Romans 12:2, where it says, make a point to not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's what you're doing. You're trying to restore your mind through the Spirit to be more like Christ. And so that's your goal, is you're trying to make sure that your beliefs are lined up with what's good and true and beautiful. So as you deepen your understanding of your beliefs, you're really strengthening them. And that's your goal. You're not trying to tear them down and say, well, is what I really believe true? And trying to tear down, belief brick by brick. Because if you do that, you are just going to be walking down a path that you don't want to go. You're going to go down that path of doubt, and you're going to end up in a winter season. But by strengthening them, you can live out your practical theology fully and point others to God through Christ. And that's really what we want, right? We want to figure out how we live and how we can test and approve what God's will is, so that we can hold up our beliefs and actions and determine if they line up with His will. And then by doing that, we can be a good testimony to the world around us for the goodness of God. We want to be restorationist, reformationist. We want to restore our own selves while reforming Christianity as a whole to be holy, biblical, and faithful. So let's talk about how to actually do this. So I've talked a lot about the theory of why we're using these words, what we're trying to accomplish with this. But let's figure out how to actually do this idea of this like practical theology, this method of Christian living. So we need a way to figure out how to live out Christianity in every area of our lives. So we want to figure out how to navigate parenting and possessions, money, marriage, Sabbath, and yes, even cleaning and decluttering, which is something I've talked about on the blog. Our faith has bearing in all of these aspects of our lives. So how do we figure out what our faith has to say about that? Well, practical theology is a method to do this. It's a method to figure out how to do Christian living now. And it requires something of you, though. It requires you to think about what you believe, and it requires you to create principles based on that. And you have to use discernment to make sure you're lining up your actions with your predetermined principles, your predetermined beliefs. And so again, in the upcoming episodes, I'm going to be talking about this, and you can get some workbooks on the shop to help you to understand how to do this and to actually write out some of your beliefs and what you think Christian virtues are, and some principles. So the first step, you need to create a personal statement of faith. So a statement of faith is just what you believe. It's like a doctrinal statement about God or about Jesus or about the Bible. And so this concerns doctrinal theology. And so most of our understanding of theology is encompassed in your statement of faith. You need to create a statement of faith that includes your basic theological beliefs. One, so that you can understand what you believe. A lot of people have never really thought. They know the gospel, and they know, maybe what they said whenever they got baptized, that they believe that, God is God, and that Jesus is His Son, and that, they will be raised at the end of time. They know all of those things, but they don't know all the ins and outs of their beliefs. And part of that is just because you've never really thought about it. And so creating a personal statement of faith, rather than just relying on what your church is saying, it just requires a little bit more thought from you. And then again, that will add to some of the sticking power of your statement of faith so that you can understand it a little bit better. So normally to create a statement of faith, you might, go through a systematic theology book. Maybe you look at some catechisms. Again, I have a workbook on the blog that kind of goes through this process, and we'll talk about this in the next episode. Most churches and institutions have a statement of faith that you can go back and look at. And importantly, you can as you read through this, you could change some of the convictions about your faith and your statement of faith, but you may not. But what you will do is you will have an answer to defend what you believe. And that's the goal, is that you want to make every point to have an answer to defend what you believe. You want to know why you believe what you believe about everything from God's word, Satan, to infant versus adult baptism. All of these things are important. Now, after you start with your statement of faith, so you understand what you believe and why you believe what you believe, the next thing that you want to do is you want to create a list of biblical Christian virtues. And the reason why you want to do that is because virtues are basically the values that you base your life on. Value-based principles or value-based, vision statements, all those kinds of things are very popular in, business culture. And so this is nothing new. But the reason why I'm using the word Christian virtue is that virtue is this idea of moral excellence. And so what you want to do is try to figure out some key virtues that you see across all of Scripture. And these virtues become basically, I would narrow them down to maybe 10 or 15, and you would use these virtues to guide your decisions. These are things that you think are crucial to the Christian faith. Now, knowing this is something that you can work to add these virtues into your life. It can be something that you work to teach your kids. But it's important to kind of narrow down these virtues because there's a lot of things that are good. Creativity, that's a great thing. And that is something that culture values. But do we think creativity is a Christian virtue? Innovation is another one. I was looking up some values that are important. And innovation is another one. Strength is another one. But the thing is like, are those Christian values? Or are those things that culture says is a good thing? And so having a list of Christian values that you can look at the Bible and you could say, okay, the Bible backs up this virtue across the whole Bible. So I see this from Genesis to Revelation. This virtue is taught. If we can find that, then that is something that we can base our life on, and it can become kind of like a guiding word. Again, we're basing our life on these virtues. Something like faithfulness or obedience. These are Christian virtues, and we could see them from the beginning of the Bible till the end. And if we know that it's a Christian virtue, then we know that that needs to be of prime importance in our life. But it requires some thought from you, just like your statement of faith requires thought from you. It requires some thought for you to work through what those Christian virtues actually are. After you develop your Christian virtues, then you can develop some biblical principles that you can base your life on. So what you would do is you would take your core virtue and then you would figure out how to apply this. I think stewardship is a Christian virtue. And so looking at stewardship, you could then apply what that actually looks like, that you steward, your possessions and your family, all the roles and responsibilities that you have in your life well. That would be a guiding principle. So stewardship is the virtue that we can trace throughout the Bible. And then the guiding principle is how you apply that virtue. So again, I would say you want to memorize these things. It adds to the sticking power of your method if you kind of narrow it down. It also requires just a little bit more thought from you. If you can't say, oh, there's 100 virtues, if you have to narrow it down to, 10 or 15 virtues, maybe 20 principles, it requires you to really, really be thoughtful about what the Bible is actually teaching and what is maybe just something that's cultural. Maybe how could I, it would just requires a little bit more thought. And I think that's why it's so beneficial. So another example of how this could all work out is to trace, something like reading your Bible. Well, the doctrinal belief for that is that the Bible is infallible and it is self-sufficient, and it's God's way of communicating with us about how we should live. So if we say, okay, that is what the Bible is, and I'm sure there's things I could add to that as well. The principle then could be, I read my Bible regularly as my daily bread and trust what it says and apply it faithfully to my life. So what we've done is we've taken that statement of faith and we see a Christian virtue from that and a guiding principle that we can base our life on. And then that guiding principle, I can easily apply that guiding principle to my life by saying, okay, if I read my Bible daily, this is something that I can do every day and I can check to see if I've done it. So formulating our practical theology in this way gives us a really easy and more accessible way to apply some of these beliefs in the Bible. And part of it is not that you've never been told that, but it's because you're going through and you're thinking about things systematically, and then you're developing a method from that systematic study of what you believe. So the last step is just the daily living. So after you've done all this thought, you formulated your statement of faith, your core Christian virtues, and your guiding principles. You've done all the thought behind it. And so then it just becomes this step-by-step process of applying these principles regularly with discernment. Because again, it's flexible. It's something that is not, you can never wear pants or you're going to go to hell. It's something that is, you are every day applying principles faithfully, but with discernment. So if you say, okay, one of the core Christian values, which I don't know if this is true or not, maybe you can lump it in with humility, but maybe modesty is a Christian virtue. And so if that's what you say a Christian virtue is, then you have to say, okay, well, how do I apply this faithfully with discernment? Is modesty, is it just about the way you physically dress, or is it how you are modest and humble in heart? And so then you see how it becomes less legalistic and more about your attitude, which is exactly what Christ was always about. He was much less about, the jot and tittle of the law, and he fulfilled those things, but he was much more about your attitude, which I feel like that actually holds us to a higher standard, not trying to make sure that we're following the law to a T, but instead making sure our hearts match what the law is trying to get us to have. And that is actually harder to do than just making sure that we follow the law. So I think as we look at the rest of these episodes, as we go further into depth with these 4 steps, you will begin to create this really fleshed out view of how to daily live for God. And part of it is because you are thinking through these 3 areas of your life so that you are able to apply it. Because I think for the most part, most of us, it's not that we think too much about what we believe. I think for most of us, it's not that we are trying to do too much for God. I think for most of us, it's that we don't think about it enough. And so we may have never looked at our church's statement of faith. We don't even really know what it says. We know what they teach on Sundays, maybe, but we've never really thought deeply about what we believe about angels or what we believe about, the covenant theology versus dispensationalism. Like we haven't never thought about that. You might not even know what those terms are. And so thinking about it deeply is just going to help us. It's going to strengthen our faith and make us more able to understand the Bible better and what we read in the Bible. And so I don't think any of the work that you do thinking through some of these things will be wasted. I think it will just turn your heart to God more fully. So let's review what we've talked about. So theology, it impacts every part of our life, and we want to make sure that we are setting our minds to be transformed to the image of Christ. And the best way to do this is to think deeply about what we believe, why we believe, and what I would say the best way to do that is to follow this method of Christian living. And so this method has 4 different parts. The first part is to develop your personal statement of faith. So you're taking the faith of maybe your church or your parents, and you're saying, okay, do I agree with this? And then if I don't, what do I actually believe? So you're creating your personal statement of faith. And then the second one is to develop a list of core Christian virtues. And so these Christian virtues are things that we find throughout the whole Bible that are things that we base our life on. So what values, morals, virtues do we find throughout the whole Bible that should be the way that we would describe our lives and who we are as people? And then lastly, what are guiding principles that we can create from those virtues in order to guide our everyday decision making, to, again, try to make us more into the image of Christ. So I would love to hear what you think about this. You can comment on this episode. You can subscribe, leave a 1 to 2 sentence rating and review. That's the best way to support us. And again, it's absolutely for free. So if you would like to support me, you can also go to amorebeautiful.collective.com/AMBL shop, and you can see any of the resources on there. Again, on the shop, there are some workbooks that work through this whole process. We'll be talking about it a little bit more in the upcoming episodes, but if you are interested, please check that out. Until next time, I hope you keep creating a life you love and cultivating your heart for God. See you then.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of a More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. If you haven't yet, please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts to help others find the show. While you're there, you can like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Don't forget to check out the blog and our store for more encouragement and resources on how to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher, and I'll see you next week.